Usually when we think about a safe space, we picture a home, a sanctuary, right? You lock your doors at night, you turn off the porch light, and there's this comforting illusion that you've shut out all the dangers of the world.
Yeah, you draw a clear, clean dividing line. Inside is safety, outside is the unknown.
Exactly. The architecture of our entire lives is basically built on that assumption.
Right. We trust that a locked door is a physical barrier between us and, whoever might mean us harm. But when you examine the darkest corners of human psychology, that locked door means absolutely nothing.
Right.
Because the ultimate danger isn't always the stranger trying to break into your house in the dead of night. Sometimes the danger is the person who invited you into theirs.
What if that house you just walked into was specifically engineered down to the cinder blocks, the two-way mirrors, and the acoustic soundproofing to ensure you never, ever leave?
It is the absolute definition of a waking nightmare.
It really is. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are undertaking a meticulous forensic timeline of one of the most chilling, just completely depraved partnerships in criminal history.
We're tracing the exact paths of two men, Leonard Lake and Charles Ning.
Right. We will analyze their modus operandi, dissect the twisted psychological mechanisms that made their partnership so uniquely lethal, and walk step by step through the reality of the crimes they committed in a remote cabin in Wilseyville, California.
But before we go any further, we owe you a very clear warning.
Yes, definitely.
We are not censoring anything today. The details of these crimes are profoundly disturbing. They involve extreme psychological and physical torture, sexual enslavement, and the murder of entire families.
Including infants.
Yeah, including infants. It is horrifying material, but understanding exactly what happened, and more importantly, how it was allowed to happen, is vital to understanding how these two operated.
We have to dissect how a vortex of shared deviance can escalate into unimaginable violence. Because monsters are not just born in a vacuum,
Exactly. They're forged over years of isolation, trauma, and unchecked delusions.
So to comprehend the sheer scale of the slaughter that occurred in the mid-1980s, we first have to look at the incredibly distinct, deeply warped paths that brought these two men together.
Let's start by looking at San Francisco in 1945. This is when Leonard Lake is born.
Right. And when you look at his early life, the cracks in the foundation are not just visible, they are gaping almost immediately.
Yeah, the psychological fracturing begins really early on. His parents divorced when he was just 6 years old.
Which, for a child, especially in the early 1950s when divorce was much less common and highly stigmatized, that's a profound trauma.
It is. He felt entirely abandoned by his mother, a woman he intensely adored. So he and his siblings were sent to live with their maternal grandmother.
And this is the inflection point where things take a deeply disturbing turn.
Definitely. The grandmother did not provide a stable healing environment. In fact, she reportedly encouraged his developing obsessions.
Wait, really?
Yeah. She actively handed a young Leonard Lake a camera and encouraged him to take nude photographs of his own sisters.
God, imagine the adult who is supposed to be your ultimate protector, your moral compass, actively cultivating your sexual deviance.
It's staggering to think about the wiring in a young brain being crossed so early. And it didn't just stop at photography. The historical record shows he was sexually abusing his sisters.
He was being taught that boundaries did not exist and that other human beings, specifically women, were objects for his lens and his gratification.
Right. And right alongside this sexual deviance was a developing, terrifying sadism. As a child, Lake allegedly killed live mice by dissolving them in vats of chemicals.
I want to pause on that because, dissolving mice isn't just a child hurting an animal. It is an act of total erasure.
The mechanism of destruction is what really matters there. Many serial killers have a history of animal cruelty, right?
Like the classic McDonald triad.
Exactly, where they torture animals for the thrill of power. But dissolving a living creature in acid or chemicals, that shows a fascination not just with causing pain, but with the total annihilation of the physical body.
Like a rehearsal.
Yeah, a rehearsal for making things disappear without a trace. He was a highly intelligent kid, but his internal world was becoming entirely corrupted by the concept of ultimate control.
And then, in his late teens, he reads a book that essentially becomes the architectural blueprint for his entire life. John Fowles' 1963 novel, The Collector.
If you haven't read The Collector, the premise is vital to understanding Leonard Lake. It's about a deeply isolated, socially inept man named Frederick Clegg who collects butterflies.
Right.
He wins the lottery, buys a remote house in the countryside, and decides to collect a beautiful young art student named Miranda.
He kidnaps her and locks her in a specially constructed cellar.
Yeah. And the chilling part of the book is that the kidnapper genuinely believes he's a gentleman. He thinks that if he just keeps her captive long enough in this perfect little environment he built, she'll eventually realize she loved him.
I mean, to the general public, The Collector is a brilliant psychological thriller about class and obsession. But to Leonard Lake, it was a literal instruction manual.
It really was. The book planted a seed that grew into a lifelong, consuming fantasy. The idea of capturing women, stripping them of their autonomy, and keeping them as submissive objects was permanently lodged in his brain.
But before he could physically act on this fantasy, he actually enlisted in the United States Marines in 1964.
Yeah, he served 2 tours in the Vietnam War as a radar electronics technician.
The military environment, especially during the height of the Vietnam War, is not exactly a stabilizing force for a mind that is already fracturing,
Not at all. And his time there ended abruptly. While stationed in Da Nang, Vietnam, Lake suffered what military doctors at the time termed a delusional breakdown.
So what does that look like?
He began exhibiting severe paranoia and losing touch with reality. He was given psychotherapy and was eventually sent back to the States, receiving a medical discharge in 1971.
And the formal diagnosis he walked away with was schizoid personality disorder.
Right.
We hear terms like schizophrenia and schizoid thrown around a lot in pop culture, often incorrectly. Walk us through what schizoid personality disorder actually means, specifically in the context of how Leonard Lake operated.
It's a really critical distinction to make. Schizoid personality disorder is not schizophrenia. It doesn't typically involve hallucinations.
Okay.
Instead, it's characterized by a profound, pervasive detachment from social relationships and a severely restricted range of emotional expression. A person with this disorder often prefers absolute isolation.
Like they just don't want to be around people at all?
Exactly. They seem entirely indifferent to the praise or criticism of others, and they find little to no pleasure in normal human activities.
So for Lake, this disorder layered perfectly over his deep-seated resentment of women, a resentment that really stemmed from his mother's abandonment.
Yeah, and he even had a brief marriage in 1969 that failed catastrophically when his wife left him after discovering his obsession with making amateur sadomasochistic pornography.
Wow, so every rejection just reinforced his schizoid detachment.
Right. He didn't want a partner with free will, he wanted a possession.
But he did eventually find someone who indulged that obsession, which is honestly one of the more baffling parts of this story.
Yeah, after bouncing around a hippie commune and living on a survivalist ranch in the 1970s, he met a woman named Claire Lynn Balaz.
Who went by the nickname Cricket, right?
Yeah, Cricket. They met in 1975 and eventually married in 1981. Cricket was not a captive. She was a woman who seemingly accepted Lake's darkest fantasies and actively participated in his sadomasochistic pornography and bondage games.
Finding someone to validate your darkest impulses can be incredibly dangerous. For Lake, Cricket provided this baseline of normalcy while indulging his deviance.
And parallel to this, Lake was developing a severe obsession with the end of the world. He became a hardcore survivalist.
He was convinced a nuclear holocaust was imminent.
Exactly. So he started stockpiling weapons and supplies. He was building an isolated, heavily fortified psychological and physical world.
He's creating a fortress. He has the fantasy, he has a willing partner in Cricket, and he's building this heavily armed, off-the-grid lifestyle.
Right.
And this is the exact moment his path collides with a young man who comes from a completely different hemisphere but carries a remarkably similar darkness. Let's shift our focus to Charles Nang.
Eng was born in 1960 in British Hong Kong to a wealthy family.
But wealthy in this case was the furthest thing from safe.
Absolutely. The financial privilege masked a horrific domestic reality. Eng's father was a wealthy executive, but he was also an intensely demanding, brutally abusive authoritarian.
Right.
The abuse Charles suffered wasn't just physical discipline, it was calculated psychological torture. His father would beat him severely for minor infractions, and then he would physically tie the boy to a window.
That's just sick.
And while Charles was tied up, his father would tell him that he was doing this because he loved him. He claimed the torture was necessary to make him strong.
That is profound psychological warping. When a parent does that, they are fundamentally altering the child's definition of love. You're teaching a young, developing brain to equate physical pain, physical bondage, and complete subjugation with paternal affection and authority.
The resulting damage was immense, and he became a deeply troubled, aggressive loner. He was expelled from multiple schools in Hong Kong.
And then there was a shoplifting arrest at age 15, right?
Yeah, and after that, his father, trying to wash his hands of the problem, shipped Charles off to Bentham Grammar School, a very strict boarding school in North Yorkshire, England.
But simply changing the geography doesn't fix underlying trauma. Emmy's behavior just escalated.
Right. He was expelled from Bentham shortly after arriving for stealing from other students and for sending highly explicit sexually harassing letters to a teacher.
So he's sent back to Hong Kong, but he doesn't stay. He eventually makes his way to the United States on a student visa in 1978.
He enrolls at a college in Belmont, California, but he drops out after just one semester, gets involved in a hit-and-run accident, and then, to avoid prosecution for the accident, he decides to join the United States Marines.
And the enlistment itself was completely fraudulent.
Oh, yeah. He used fake documents and falsely claimed he was born in Bloomington, Indiana.
Unbelievable.
Once inside the Marines, Eng's deep lack of self-confidence and his traumatic upbringing began to manifest in a bizarre, grandiose fantasy life. He began to genuinely believe he was a reincarnated ninja warrior.
A ninja warrior?
Yeah, he developed an intense obsession with martial arts, stealth, and militarism. He wanted to be a lethal weapon. But despite the rigid structure of the military, he completely lacked the discipline to follow the rules.
Right. Less than a year into his service, he gets arrested by military police. He had managed to steal $11,500 worth of heavy automatic weapons from the Kaneohe Bay Base Armory in Hawaii.
Facing a serious court-martial for the theft, he escapes military custody in 1980 and goes on the run.
He's heavily armed, he's a fugitive, and he has nowhere to go. And this brings us to the convergence point.
Yeah.
In 1981, Leonard Lake, who is managing a motel in Mendocino County, California, places an advertisement in a right-wing survivalist magazine. He's looking for like-minded individuals to join his survivalist compound.
And Charles Eng, reading that magazine while on the run, answers the ad.
They met through a classified ad, which is just insane to think about in the context of what they became. It's like two highly specific, highly volatile chemicals finding each other in a classified ad. But do you think Lake was actively looking for an accomplice to kill or just a lackey to dominate?
Based on a deep reading of Lake's extensive journals from this period, he wasn't explicitly hunting for a killer just yet. He was hunting for a disciple.
Okay.
Lake had this overwhelming, all-consuming need for total control. We see it in his obsession with the captive and the collector, and we see it in his dynamic with Cricket. He wanted subjects.
And Aang, conversely, had been violently conditioned by his father to seek out and submit to a strong, abusive male authority figure.
Exactly. He craved the structure of dominance, so long as he was the favored subordinate. Aang would later testify during his trial that he looked up to Lake as a brotherly, fatherly figure.
It's a parasitic, symbiotic existence. Lake gets the obedient, aggressive soldier he craves to stroke his ego, and Aang gets the dominant father figure he desperately needs to give his life direction.
They formed this incredibly twisted pseudo-family with Cricket, bonding over their shared love of weapons, survivalism, and sadomasochistic games.
But this initial honeymoon period of shared deviance was cut short by the law, leading to a separation that inadvertently allowed Lake to graduate to murder.
Right. In April 1982, the FBI raided the mobile home that Lake and Aang were sharing in Ukiah, California. They were acting on a tip and found the massive stash of illegal stolen military weapons that Aang had brought with him from Hawaii.
So Aang was captured, returned to military custody, pleaded guilty to theft and desertion, and was sentenced to 18 months at the military prison at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas.
And Lake, amazingly, manages to get released on bond after the raid. And the second he's out, he jumps bail and goes completely off the grid. He assumes fake identities.
And this physical separation from Aang, this forced isolation as a fugitive, is arguably what pushes Lake over the edge. He crosses the line from being a man with dark fantasies to an active murderer.
Isolation acts as an incubator for delusions. With Aang in prison and Lake hiding out, his need for control spiked. He needed resources to stay hidden, and he had zero empathy for how he acquired them.
Which brings us to December 1982 and Leonard Lake's very first known murder. The victim was his own brother, Donald Stephen Lake.
The betrayal of targeting your own sibling is hard to stomach. Donald was 31 years old, and his background makes this even more tragic. As a child, Donald had been hit by a train and suffered severe, lifelong mental disabilities as a result.
And Leonard absolutely despised him for it. In recorded conversations and journals, Leonard referred to his disabled brother as a leech.
Yeah, he harbored decades of resentment because their mother had devoted her attention to caring for Donald, which Leonard felt was the reason he had been sent away to live with the abusive grandmother.
That deep-seated, festering resentment finally boiled over. Leonard genuinely believed his brother was a drain on resources and didn't deserve to live.
In December 1982, Leonard approaches Donald, who is living with their mother in San Francisco, and offers him a fake house-sitting job.
It's a ruse.
Completely. Donald leaves with his brother and is never seen alive again. Leonard later admitted in his diaries that he shot his brother in the head while he slept.
He murders his brother in cold blood. But this wasn't just a crime of passion or a simple act of revenge. The aftermath of this murder establishes the chilling modus operandi that Lake will rely on moving forward.
Yeah, he didn't just kill Donald to get rid of him. He hollowed him out and climbed inside his life.
He harvested his brother's identity. Lake started calling himself Alan Dre. He took Donald's identification and began cashing his dead brother's government disability checks.
You have to understand the logistics of identity theft in the early 1980s. There were no interconnected digital databases. If you had the physical paper ID, the Social Security card, and you could forge a signature on a paper check, you could easily assume someone's financial life.
To cover his tracks, Lake even forged a letter to their mother, pretending to be Donald, claiming he had moved to Reno to live with drug dealers, intentionally breaking her heart just to ensure she wouldn't file a missing persons report.
It is utterly callous. He's funding his fugitive lifestyle with the blood money of his disabled brother.
He didn't just kill his brother out of resentment. He basically harvested him for his identity and income. It's like a parasite wearing its host's skin.
And just a few months later, he proves this was not a one-time crime of opportunity. May 20th, 1983, Lake targets his friend, Charles Donald Gunnar.
Gunnar was 34 years old, and he was not just an acquaintance. He was the best man at Lake's wedding to cricket.
Lake invites Gunnar on a road trip to Las Vegas. A few days pass, and Lake returns alone. He's driving Gunnar's van, and he casually tells mutual friends that Gunnar had met a woman in Vegas and decided to just run off with her.
And once again, the parasitic behavior repeats. Lake steals Gunnar's identity. He takes over Gunnar's bank accounts, cashes his checks, and literally starts introducing himself to strangers as Charles Gunnar.
Gunnar's body wouldn't be discovered until 1992, buried on a remote piece of property that was about to become the epicenter of this entire nightmare.
Which brings us to the dungeon. Lake, using his stolen identities and funds, moves to a highly remote 2.5-acre property in Wilseyville, California.
If you aren't familiar with the geography of Wilseyville in the 1980s, it is incredibly isolated. It's located in the rugged foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains.
It's rural, heavily wooded, and the kind of place where neighbors are spread far apart and people fiercely value their privacy.
Yeah.
Nobody bothers you. Nobody asks what you are building.
It was the perfect, secluded canvas for Lake to bring the plot of The Collector to life. And the property itself was actually owned by his ex-wife Cricket's parents, which adds another layer of bizarre family complicity.
Once he moved in, he immediately started constructing what he explicitly referred to in his extensive journals as his dungeon.
He built a cinder block structure right next to the main cabin. To the casual observer or a visiting family member, it just looked like a tool shed.
But it was meticulously hidden. The entrance was concealed behind a heavy 2x4 wooden tool shelf that swung open like a secret door.
The sensory details of what was behind that shelf are terrifying. You walk through this hidden door into a tiny 3-by-6-foot windowless cell. It was pitch black, like being trapped in a mine shaft.
He outfitted it with a small, cheap mattress, a bucket for a toilet, and heavy physical restraints, arm and leg shackles attached to the bed.
He installed a two-way mirror so he could sit in the adjacent room and watch his captives without them seeing him, and he even procured military-grade night vision equipment.
The physical space was designed for total sensory deprivation and control. And to accompany the physical prison, he created a psychological one.
Right, he typed up a literal formal rule book for his future victims. He called it Operation Miranda, naming the project directly after the female captive in John Fowles' novel. He taped these rules to the cinder block wall of the cell so it would be the first thing a victim saw.
The rules are a window into his pathology. They demanded total psychological and physical submission. According to the typed sheet, the captives were strictly forbidden to cross their arms or legs. They were commanded to remain completely open and physically vulnerable at all times.
They had to keep their lips parted unless they were actively eating. They could never show a hint of disrespect, either verbally or silently, through facial expressions.
When you look at this setup, how identity theft funded his grander, sicker fantasies, it's horrifying. He didn't build this overnight.
No, it points to a profound, chilling objectification of human life. Lake viewed people strictly through a lens of utility. They were categorized in his mind.
Like, men were resources and women were objects.
Exactly. Men like Donald and Charles were resources to be consumed for cash and cover. Women, on the other hand, were objects for gratification. He referred to his intended victims in his diaries as M-ladies, short for Miranda.
He didn't see them as humans with families or inner lives. They were just props waiting to be cast in the movie playing inside his head.
Right. So by the summer of 1984, the stage is completely set. Lake has the stolen money, he has the remote location in Wilseyville, and he has a fully functional, soundproof dungeon.
All he needed was his enforcer to return so the true horror could begin.
And the timing is tragically perfect. In June or July of 1984, Charles Eng is dishonorably discharged and finally released from the military prison at Fort Leavenworth.
And the moment the prison doors open, Eng makes a beeline straight back to California to reunite with Lake and Cricket.
According to Lake's own meticulous diaries, the reunion wasn't immediately a plunge into murder. When Lake first unveiled the bunker and explained the reality of Operation Miranda to Eng was initially very hesitant to get involved.
Really? He was hesitant.
Yeah, but Lake was a master manipulator, and he knew exactly how to trigger Eng's conditioning. Lake didn't force him. He seduced him into the violence.
By using their past.
Exactly. He used their shared history of sadomasochistic games to slowly condition Eng. He intertwined the concepts of pain, dominance, and fatherly approval, mirroring the exact abuse Eng had suffered from his father in Hong Kong.
Wow.
Within weeks, Eng's hesitation evaporated, replaced by an eager, sadistic enthusiasm.
They became a synchronized killing machine. They developed a horrifyingly strict forensic modus operandi. They weren't just killing randomly, they had a system.
The system was brutally efficient. They would lure a group or a family to the Wilseyville property or ambush them elsewhere. The men and male infants were immediately categorized as liabilities.
Because they couldn't be controlled as easily.
Right, and they couldn't be used for Lake's fantasy. So the men were executed almost immediately, usually shot in the head or bludgeoned to death to eliminate any physical threat or potential witnesses.
But the women were kept alive.
Yes. The women were violently separated from their families, dragged into the cinder block bunker, and locked inside. They were subjected to systematic rape and severe psychological torture.
And crucially, Lake and Eng videotaped almost all of these assaults.
The women were kept as prisoners until their will was entirely broken or until they were no longer useful to Lake's fantasy, at which point they were murdered.
And the disposal of the bodies is where Lake's childhood habit of dissolving mice comes back in a terrifying way. They didn't just dig a hole and bury the bodies. They went to extreme, labor-intensive lengths to destroy the physical evidence of their crimes.
The effort required to do what they did is staggering. When you murder someone, disposing of an entire adult human skeleton is incredibly difficult.
Right.
Lake and Eng would build massive, incredibly hot bonfires on the property and burn the bodies. But fire doesn't destroy large bones, so they would go into the ashes, retrieve the charred bones, and use heavy tools, including an electric saw and hammers that police later found covered in blood, to physically crush the remaining bones into tiny fragments.
Those fragments were then scattered across the 2.5 acres or buried in shallow, hidden trenches. They wanted total annihilation of the person.
Let's trace this first joint killing spree in the summer of 1984. The timeline is critical here. There is one victim who bridges the gap between Lake's solo kills and the partnership with N.
Right. May 1st, 1984. Jeffrey Dean Askren.
Askren was a 30-year-old man who went missing from Santa Clara, California. 3 days after he failed to show up for work, police found his Honda parked just 6 miles down the road from Lake's Wilseyville cabin.
And because Eng wasn't officially released from Leavenworth until June or July, Askren was likely Lake's final solo kill, or perhaps the very first victim, as the timeline of Eng's arrival blurred.
But either way, Askren's car being found so close proves the Wilseyville property was now a black hole pulling people in.
By July, there is no doubt they're hunting together, and they're escalating rapidly. July 11th, 1984. They target a 96-year-old San Francisco DJ named Donald Albert Giulietti and his roommate, Richard Carrazza.
They don't lure them to the cabin. Eng breaks directly into their San Francisco apartment to rob them. During the home invasion, Eng opens fire on both men. Giulietti is shot in the head and dies at the scene.
But Corazza is shot directly in the chest, and miraculously, he survives the attack.
He's the only known survivor of either Lake or Eng, and he was able to positively identify Charles Eng as the shooter to the police.
But the police aren't fast enough. Before they can track Eng down, the violence escalates exponentially. Just 2 weeks later, on July 25, 1984, they target an entire family, the Dubs family.
Harvey Dubs was 30, his wife Deborah was 33, and their infant son, Sean, was just 1 year old.
The Dubs family had placed a simple classified ad in a local paper to sell some used video equipment.
Lake and Eng, constantly scanning the papers for opportunities, saw the ad. On the night the family vanished, Deborah Dubs was on the phone with a friend. She casually mentioned that the doorbell was ringing and that 2 men had arrived to look at the video equipment.
She hung up the phone, and the family was never heard from again.
Based on the MO, Harvey and baby Sean were murdered immediately. Deborah was abducted, taken to the Wellesleyville bunker, and subjected to the nightmare of Operation Miranda.
And she was horrifically tortured. The assault on Deborah was captured on the very video equipment they had just stolen from her home.
The violence depicted on that specific tape was so severe that investigators who reviewed it later stated unequivocally that she could not have survived the physical trauma of what was done to her on camera.
The agonizing irony of that is almost impossible to process. They wanted a female victim, yes, but they targeted the Dubs family specifically to steal the video camera. It's chilling to think that they abducted and slaughtered an entire family, including a 1-year-old baby, just to acquire the exact piece of technology they needed to document their future crimes.
It is so cold and calculated.
Let's analyze this intense compulsion. Why did Lake need to film the torture? Why keep a 250-page diary detailing the murders? Why risk keeping all this evidence?
It is the ultimate expression of trophy keeping in the psychology of serial killers. For Leonard Lake, the fantasy in his head was just as important, if not more so, than the physical act of murder. The act itself is fleeting.
So the tapes were a way to hold on to it.
Exactly. By filming the assaults, by keeping the women's driver's licenses, and by meticulously journaling every single detail of the abductions, Lake was creating a permanent archive. It allowed him to rewind and relive the absolute dominance and power long after the victim was dead and the ashes were scattered.
It was tangible proof to himself that he was a master of his universe, a god in his own twisted reality.
The tapes and the writings weren't just records. They were fuel that sustained his delusion of grandeur.
With the video equipment secured, the dam just breaks. They go totally out of control. Right around the same time, in late July or August 1984, 2 more men vanish into the Wellesleyville property. Maurice Anthony Rock, 37, and Reginald Frisbee, 29.
The connection here shows how casually Lake hunted. Lake had actually rented a room under his fake name, Alan Dre, in the exact same San Francisco rooming house where Maurice Rock lived.
When Rock vanished, a neighbor recalled seeing a man matching Lake's description moving a refrigerator out of Rock's empty room.
Reggie Frisbee's initial connection to the killers was less clear, but he disappeared around the exact same time.
And Frisbee's case is fascinating from a forensic standpoint because he remained an unidentified John Doe for decades, until very recently.
Yes, in January 2025, authorities finally identified Frisbee's remains using investigative genetic genealogy. You have to understand the science required to achieve that. Fire destroys DNA.
Right, because of the bonfires.
When Lake and M burned the bodies and crushed the bones, they were destroying the genetic material. But occasionally, deep inside the matrix of a thick piece of bone, a tiny fragment of marrow is shielded from the extreme heat.
Scientists were able to extract viable DNA from one of these tiny 40-year-old burned bone fragments found at Wellesleyville, sequence it, run it through genealogical databases, and finally give Reggie Frisbee his name back.
And they determined he was buried in the exact same shallow grave as Maurice Rock.
It is incredible science, bringing closure decades later. But back in 1984, as the year turns into 1985, Lake and Eng are moving too fast for anyone to catch on. Their victim pool expands rapidly, and we see an evolution in how they hunt.
They're no longer just waiting passively for classified ads. They're aggressively sourcing victims from everywhere. Rooming houses, moving company jobs, used car ads, eventually their own neighbors.
The escalation is terrifying because it shows their shrinking boundaries. They're getting bolder. October 15th, 1984, Randy Vern Jacobson, 35 years old.
He disappears from the same San Francisco rooming house area after engaging in a business deal with Lake. Lake murders him, steals his identity, and even attempts to steal Jacobson's van, though it gets towed by the city before Lake can move it.
Then we get to November 2, 1984. This is a massively crucial case in the timeline. Paul Stephen Cosner, 39 years old.
Paul Cosner had placed a newspaper ad to sell his 1980 brown Honda Prelude. He told his family he was going to show the car to a potential buyer in San Francisco, a man he specifically described on the phone as weird.
Paul never came back. Lake and Eng murdered Cosner and stole the Honda Prelude. Cosner's physical body has never been found to this day.
But Paul Cosner had a sister named Sharon, and her story is one of the most incredible displays of sheer willpower I have ever heard.
When Paul went missing, she went to the San Francisco police. But you have to remember 1980s police bureaucracy. They essentially brushed her off.
They told her it is not illegal for a 39-year-old man to disappear, so they wouldn't actively search for a missing adult. But they noted they would look for a stolen car.
So Sharon weaponized that loophole. She didn't just make a few phone calls. She started a relentless, exhausting, months-long campaign against the police department.
She called the police constantly, reporting the car missing every single month to ensure that the Honda Prelude's vehicle identification number, the VIN, stayed active on the police hot sheet.
She fly-posted the entire city of San Francisco with pictures of her brother. She refused to let the bureaucracy swallow her brother's case. And her exhausting persistence is ultimately the single thread that brings this entire nightmare crashing down.
But before her efforts bear fruit, the timeline of death just keeps accelerating, and the proximity of the victims gets closer and closer to Charles Nang's personal life.
November 16, 1984. Cheryl Lynn Okoro, 25 years old. She disappears from the exact same rooming house where Maurice Rock had lived.
And then Charles Nang starts actively hunting within his own social and professional circle. January 20, 1985. Clifford Raymond Paranto, 23 years old.
He was a direct co-worker of Eng's at the Dennis Moving Company in San Francisco.
Paranto vanishes without a trace. A few months later, Leonard Lake is seen selling Paranto's motorcycle.
A month after that, February 24, 1985. Jeffrey Dean Gerald, 25. He also goes missing after telling friends he was going to help Eng move some furniture for a side job.
This brings us to April 1985, which represents the final, most audacious and horrifying escalation of their entire spree.
April 12th. They target Michael Sean Carroll, 22, and his girlfriend, Kathleen Elizabeth Allen, who was only 18 years old.
And the connection here is undeniable. Carroll actually knew personally from their time serving together in the Fort Leavenworth military prison.
Yes. They lure Carroll and murder him, but they don't stop there. Lake then calls Kathleen Allen at her workplace.
He lies to the 18-year-old, telling her that Carroll is up at Lake Tahoe and might have been shot, and he needs her to come with him immediately. She panics, leaves her job, and gets into a car with Lake.
She is driven straight to Wilseyville, locked in the cinderblock cell, and becomes an M-lady. And we know the terrifying reality of her final days because of the videotapes found later.
Lake is captured on tape, sitting calmly, warning a terrified 18-year-old Kathleen. He tells her, quote, "If you don't go along with us, we'll probably take you into the bed, tie you down, rape you, shoot you, and bury you."
Exactly 1 week after abducting Kathleen Allen, April 19, 1985, Lake and Eng target their own neighbors.
When you look at the geography of this, it is truly beyond belief. The victims are Lonnie Wainbond Sr., 27, his girlfriend Brenda Sue O'Connor, 20, their baby boy, Lonnie Jr., who is just 1 year old, and a friend who was staying with them, Robin Scott Stapley, 26.
This family lived in a house just 50 yards away from Lake's Wilseyville cabin.
50 yards. They shared a property line. They could literally see each other's front doors through the trees.
Lake and Nang walked over and executed the men. The forensic evidence recovered later showed the sheer brutality of it. Robin Scott Stapley was found with a handgun shoved so violently down his throat that it broke his teeth before the trigger was pulled.
Maybe Lonnie was never found, but based on their established MO, he was almost certainly murdered immediately. And Brenda Sue O'Connor was dragged 50 yards through the dirt to the bunker.
Brenda is the other woman featured heavily on the notorious M-Ladies tape.
The footage of Brenda is harrowing to even describe. Eng is seen on camera physically cutting Brenda's bra off her body with a large knife. Brenda is handcuffed, sobbing, terrified, and she is begging them to tell her what they have done to her baby.
And Eng looks at this grieving, terrified mother and coldly says, "You can cry and stuff like the rest of them, but it won't do any good. We are pretty cold-hearted, so to speak."
When Brenda asks them directly if they're going to kill her, Lake responds from off camera. His voice is perfectly calm. He says, "That's up to you, Brenda."
It is absolute distilled psychological torture. And I want to point out the sheer audacity of murdering the family living 50 yards away. They were totally out of control at this point. And, N later claimed he was just a follower, but he specifically targeted his own coworkers and military buddies like Paranto, Gerald, and Carol. How does that shatter his defense?
It destroys the duress defense entirely. A reluctant accomplice, someone who is genuinely terrified for their life, does not go to their own workplace, single out a coworker they know personally, and lure them to a death camp.
Exactly.
Aang wasn't a hostage to Lake's madness. He was an active procurer. He was hunting within his own social network to feed the Wilseyville dungeon. He enjoyed the power, the stealth, and the thrill of it. He was living out his ninja fantasy by playing God with the lives of people who trusted him.
So by May of 1985, they had built a seemingly impenetrable fortress of horror in the woods. But it wasn't brilliant detective work that brought them down. It was an act of staggering, arrogant stupidity.
It really was. The downfall is almost anticlimactic in its banality. June say, 1985. Lake and Aang drive into South San Francisco and go to the South City lumber store.
N, despite having stolen identities, stolen cash, and a compound full of stolen goods, is a severe kleptomaniac. He simply cannot help himself.
He walks down an aisle, picks up a bench vise worth $75, conceals it, and walks right out the front door.
A $75 piece of metal.
An observant employee sees him do it, calls the police, and chases them out into the parking lot. N throws the stolen vise into the trunk of the car they drove, the brown 1980 Honda Prelude, and just takes off running on foot. He vanishes into the city.
But Lake stays behind in the parking lot. Lake's ego is so massive at this point that he genuinely believes he can just talk his way out of a petty shoplifting charge.
He calmly tells the angry employee there has been a huge misunderstanding, that he actually paid for the vice, and tries to smooth things over.
And then a South San Francisco police officer pulls into the parking lot.
The officer walks up, assesses the situation, and looks into the open trunk of the Honda to retrieve the stolen vice. And sitting right there, in plain view next to a $75 tool, is a .22 caliber pistol equipped with an illegal silencer.
It's the ultimate serial killer paradox, isn't it? You meticulously engineer a soundproof bunker to commit perfect crimes, and you get taken down because you couldn't resist stealing a $75 piece of metal. Is this kleptomania? Or is it a subconscious desire to get caught?
While kleptomania is a real compulsion, in this specific context, it is overwhelmingly about hubris. Lake and Aang had gotten away with so much for so long right under the noses of society.
They felt untouchable.
They had murdered up to 24 people, cashed their government checks, drove their stolen cars, and lived in their houses. The normal rules of society simply no longer registered to them. They felt totally invincible.
And that invincibility manifested as incredibly sloppy risk-taking.
Stealing a vice in broad daylight wasn't a cry for help. It was an expression of their absolute contempt for the law and other people. They thought they were untouchable.
But the law caught up real fast that afternoon. The officer arrests Lake immediately for the illegal weapon. And from that moment, the entire web instantly unravels right there in the parking lot.
The arresting officer asks Lake for his identification. Lake calmly hands over a California driver's license. The name on the license is Robin Scott Stapley, the 26-year-old neighbor he had violently murdered just weeks prior.
The officer looks at the ID, looks at Lake, and immediately realizes something is wrong. Lake is 39 years old and visibly balding. He looks absolutely nothing like a 26-year-old man.
Then the officer runs the car's information through dispatch. The VIN is registered to Paul Cosner.
Remember, his sister Sharon had relentlessly called the police for months to keep that car on the hot sheet.
Exactly. It popped immediately as a stolen vehicle associated with a missing person. But the license plates physically bolted to the car belonged to Lonnie Bond, the other murdered neighbor. The gun with the silencer was registered to Stapley.
It was a rolling crime scene of stolen identities.
And crucially, when police searched the interior of the car, under the passenger seat, they found a utility bill in the name of Clarelyn Cricket Balaz, featuring a very specific address in Wilseyville, California.
They bring Lake to the police station. And sitting in the interrogation room, Lake realizes the puzzle pieces have all been put together. It's over.
He admits his real name to the detectives, and he gives up Charles Eng's name as the man who ran from the hardware store. Then he makes a very calm request. He asks the detectives for a pencil, a piece of paper, and a glass of water.
The detectives oblige and leave him alone in the interrogation room for a moment. Lake takes the pencil and writes a brief note to his ex-wife. It read, "Dearest Cricket, I love you. I forgive you. Freedom is better than all else. Love, Leonard."
And then he takes a sick of water, and he swallows 2 cyanide pills that he had secretly sewn into the lapel of his jacket.
This was a backup plan he had bragged about for years to avoid prison.
He had told Cricket and his family that he had experimented with chemicals to find the perfect lethal dose of cyanide and that he would never, ever allow himself to go back to a prison cell. A detective walks back into the interrogation room a few minutes later and finds Lake violently convulsing on the floor.
He's suffocating as the cyanide binds to the hemoglobin in his blood. He falls into a deep coma, is transported to the hospital, and dies 4 days later on June 6, 1985.
He takes the easy way out, leaving the police to follow the trail of breadcrumbs in the Honda straight to the gates of hell in Wilseyville.
Exactly. On June 4, while Lake is lying in a coma on life support, a massive team of detectives and forensic specialists head up into the Sierra Nevada foothills to search the Wilseyville property.
And what they find there defies all comprehension.
Walk us through that excavation, because it wasn't just a matter of opening a door and finding everything. It was a massive, traumatic, weeks-long undertaking for law enforcement to uncover the scale of what had happened.
They secure the main cabin first. Inside, they find the blood-stained electric saw and heavy tools. Then, they discover the 2x4 tool shelf and pull it back. They find the cinder block bunker.
Inside the pitch-black cell, they find the copy of the collector, the typed rules for Operation Randa taped to the wall, handcuffs, piles of women's clothing, and 21 photographs of nude and semi-nude women taped to the cinder blocks.
And then they move out onto the 2.5 acres of land. Lake, in his absolute arrogance, had actually drawn a literal treasure map of the property.
A treasure map.
Yeah, police followed the map to a spot in the dirt and dug up 2 buried 5-gallon plastic buckets. One bucket contained envelopes stuffed with the driver's licenses and IDs of their victims.
Based on the IDs found in that bucket, investigators suggested the total death toll could be up to 25 people.
The other bucket was the psychological mother lode. It was carefully sealed to protect the contents from the elements. Inside, they found Lake's 250-page handwritten diary detailing the philosophy and execution of his crimes, his audio recordings, and the horrifying M. Ladies videotapes showing the systematic torture of Brenda O'Connor, Kathleen Allen, and Deborah Dubbs.
But finding the physical bodies of the victims was the most grueling, emotionally devastating part of the investigation. They didn't find whole skeletons neatly buried in graves, did they?
Very few. Because Lake and Neng had spent hours burning the bodies in bonfires and crushing the remains with tools, forensics teams essentially had to sift through the dirt and ash of the property with fine mesh screens for 8 weeks.
Wow.
They unearthed roughly 45 pounds of burned, shattered human bone fragments.
45 pounds of fragments. It is hard to visualize that much destroyed human life.
It is horrific. And those fragments included baby teeth. Forensic anthropologists eventually determined that those 45 pounds of fragments represented a minimum of 11 different people.
But the ID bucket and the journals pointed to many more who were simply erased from existence completely.
Meanwhile, as the police are unearthing this house of horrors in the woods, Charles Eng is on the run, and he had help.
He did. The day after Lake swallowed the cyanide, while Lake was still on life support, Cricket Belaz actually drove up to the Wilseyville property before the police had a chance to secure it.
She went inside the cabin, filled several cardboard boxes with unknown items, and removed them from the property. To this day, we still don't know exactly what evidence she destroyed or hid.
It is infuriating. She didn't just hide evidence. She actively aided a fugitive who had just murdered multiple people.
She met up with Eng after he fled the hardware store, packed a bag with his clothes and weapons, and personally drove him to the San Francisco International Airport.
And flew to Chicago under a fake alias, took a ride to Detroit, and slipped across the border into Canada.
Relying on his survivalist training, he ended up living like a feral animal in a lean-to tent in a provincial park in Calgary, Alberta.
So, a highly trained ex-Marine, heavily armed, who has evaded an international FBI manhunt. How is he finally caught in Canada? By brilliant detective work.
No, by shoplifting again. July 6, 1985, just a month after fleeing California, N walks into a Hudson's Bay department store in Calgary. He tries to steal a can of salmon.
A can of salmon. He's a mass murderer on the run, and he risks it all for a can of fish.
The store security guard spots him and stops him. Aang pulls a gun and shoots the security guard in the hand, but the guard, despite being shot, and another employee managed to tackle N to the ground and hold him there until the Calgary police arrive and arrest him.
So they finally have him in custody. But getting him back to California to face trial for the Wilseyville murders becomes an absolute protracted circus.
The legal nightmare begins with the extradition. Canada does not have the death penalty, and their laws heavily restrict extraditing suspects to countries where they might face execution.
Aang uses this humanitarian law to his advantage, fighting extradition for 6 long years in Canadian courts.
Finally, in September 1991, the Supreme Court of Canada rules 4-3 to allow the extradition, determining the crimes were heinous enough to warrant it. According to one prosecutor involved in the case, Canada deported Aang to California exactly 18 minutes after the Supreme Court ruling came down.
But the circus doesn't stop once he lands in California. Aang weaponizes the American legal system just as thoroughly as he weaponized the Canadian one.
He stalled the trial for 7 more years. He used every single loophole available. He fired 10 different court-appointed defense attorneys. He filed malpractice lawsuits against his own lawyers to force them to recuse themselves.
He sued the state over the temperature of his prison food. He even filed a formal grievance complaining that his constitutional rights were being violated because he wasn't allowed to practice origami in his cell.
Origami. He is filing motions about paper folding while the families of his victims are sitting in agony waiting for a trial. He even managed to get the home phone number of a female juror and called her at home to try and intimidate her into forcing a mistrial.
His behavior was so disruptive that he was eventually kept in a metal cage in a separate room during recesses.
The delays were so extreme and the legal maneuvering so exhaustive that by the time the trial finally started in Orange County in 1998, the prosecution had cost the state of California $20 million.
To put that in perspective, the O.J. Simpson trial cost the state about $9 million.
And what happens to Cricket Belez during all this? The woman who participated in the sex games, who went to the cabin to remove boxes of evidence before police arrived, who physically drove the serial killer to the airport?
The prosecution desperately wanted her to testify against Aang. To secure her cooperation, they gave her blanket legal immunity from all prosecution related to the crimes.
Complete immunity. She gets a free pass.
Complete. But when the trial finally happened, Aang's defense attorney made a stunning surprise move. He called Cricket to the stand as a witness for the defense, read her immunity agreement aloud to the jury to show she was protected, and then dismissed her without asking her a single question about the crimes.
Because she hadn't given direct testimony, the prosecution couldn't cross-examine her, so she never shed light on what really happened in that cabin, and the immunity deal stood.
It is maddening. Cricket Belez literally gets blanket immunity and walks away, while Aang uses the very justice system he despised to buy himself 14 years of life and cost taxpayers $20 million. How do we reconcile the mechanisms of justice being weaponized by the guilty?
It is one of the most painful, frustrating realities of the justice system. Immunity deals are often viewed as a necessary evil by prosecutors, a bargain with the devil to secure a conviction against what is perceived as the primary threat.
Right.
And the exhaustive appeals process, the endless motions, they exist to protect the constitutional rights of the accused, which is a foundational principle of a fair legal system. But when those protections are manipulated by a monster like Aang, it feels like a profound betrayal of the victims.
It highlights the endurance required by the victims' families. People like Sharon Cosner, who fought the police to find her brother's car and then had to fight for 14 years, enduring delays and mockery, just to see the man who killed him face a jury.
And when he finally did face that jury, what was his defense?
Aang took the stand and tried to blame everything on Leonard Lake. He claimed he was just a passive observer, terrified of Lake's temper, just following orders to stay alive.
But the prosecution had the tapes. They had the diary. They played the M Ladies tape in open court. The jury saw Aang laughing on camera, cutting off clothes, physically taunting the victims.
And if that wasn't enough to shatter his defense, the prosecution introduced drawings that Aang had made while sitting in his prison cell awaiting trial.
He had drawn highly detailed mocking cartoons of his victims. One of the drawings depicted an Asian man, clearly meant to be himself, holding a baby by the legs and cooking it over a fire.
Dear God.
On February 24, 1999, the jury convicted Charles Aang of 11 counts of first-degree murder. They deadlocked on the murder of Paul Cosner, unfortunately, because his physical body was never found.
But the 11 convictions were more than enough. Aang was formally sentenced to death.
And due to a moratorium on executions in the state of California, Charles Ng remains alive on death row at the California Medical Facility to this day.
We've walked through an incredibly dense, horrific timeline, from Lake's twisted childhood trauma and Ng's abusive upbringing to their ultimate conviction. When you step back and look at the entirety of this forensic timeline, what do we take away from this descent into darkness?
The velocity of the timeline is what stands out the most. In a very short window of time, two men enabled each other's darkest, most depraved fantasies, resulting in the brutal torture and murder of at least 11 and possibly up to 25 men, women, and children.
It's staggering.
It demonstrates a terrifying psychological principle. When you combine profound isolation with shared deviance and a total absence of moral boundaries, you create a vortex of violence that escalates rapidly.
Lake had the blueprint in his head. Ng provided the physical spark and the willingness to hunt.
Together, they did things neither might have fully realized alone. It shows how toxic codependency can mutate into mass murder.
And we have to remember the human element here. The people who were pulled into that vortex. The victims were just regular people going about their lives. A guy selling a used car in the newspaper. A guy helping a friend move furniture. A family selling video equipment.
A young couple and their baby living in a quiet rural town.
It severely underscores the fragility of our everyday safety. You think you're making a simple transaction, shaking a hand over a used car, and you step into someone else's nightmare.
It is the terrifying randomness of predatory violence. You can do everything right and still cross paths with someone who views you entirely as a resource.
Which brings me to a final, deeply chilling thought for you to mull over as we end this deep dive. We focus so much on the monsters, on Leonard Lake swallowing the cyanide pill in the interrogation room, on Charles Ng drawing those horrific cartoons in his cell while fighting for his origami rights.
Yeah.
But consider the enablers who operate in the gray areas. Consider Clarilyn Cricket Balaz. She knew about the cinder block bunker. She participated in the sadomasochistic games that fueled the fantasy.
She is suspected by many investigators of helping lure victims to the property to put them at ease.
She physically removed boxes of evidence from a mass murder site, and she actively aided the escape of a serial killer. Yet, because of the blind spots and the bartering of the legal system, she walks completely free today.
It's hard to accept.
How many true atrocities are made possible, not just by the killers themselves, but by the quiet compliance of the people sleeping right next to them? Think about that the next time you lock your doors at night. Because sometimes the monster isn't trying to break in. Sometimes the monster is the one who already has the key. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and thank you for joining us on this deep dive.